The void above Vera 9 was chaos dressed in fire. What had begun as a structured defense line just an hour ago was now collapsing into a graveyard of twisted metal and glowing debris. Human ships, sleek frigates, heavy cruisers, even the towering carriers, were being carved apart by the Zarkoth fleet. Each enemy vessel was jagged, insect-like, built for intimidation as much as destruction. They moved with an organic precision, as if the entire swarm shared one ruthless mind. From the bridge of the Resolute, Lieutenant David Rourke fought to steady his breathing. The ship's hull groaned under another barrage, and showers of sparks rained from the overhead conduits. Status readouts flickered red across his console, announcing failure after failure. The smell of scorched insulation burned his nose even through the thin filter mask he wore. "Shields down to 6%, the tactical officer shouted over the roar of alarms. "Life support failing on decks 4 and 7, added another. "Casualties climbing past 30%, sir." David's eyes locked on the tactical display. The blue dots, the human fleet, were vanishing faster than reinforcements could arrive. Red icons, the Zarkoth, filled the void like a living tide. They weren't just winning, they were crushing the defense with brutal efficiency. "Hold the line," he reminded himself. "We hold, or everything falls." Behind them, down on Vera 9's surface, transports were still clawing their way skyward, loaded with civilians and alien refugees. Entire families from a dozen worlds huddled in those ships, praying that the defenders above would buy them just a few more minutes. If the line broke, those transports would be slaughtered before they even cleared orbit. A flash on the main display drew his attention. A human destroyer ripped clean in half, the explosion throwing its burning wreckage across the battle space. Every ship lost meant fewer guns covering the evacuation corridor. Every ship lost meant the swarm drew closer to Earth's outer colonies. "Sir, we can't keep this up," someone yelled. David gritted his teeth. His commanding officer, the ship's captain, stood at the front of the bridge, blood staining the collar of his uniform. He swayed with exhaustion but never left his post. He looked at David with hollow eyes that carried an unspoken message. "This fight is already lost, but we will make it cost them everything." Before David could reply, a strange transmission cut through the static-filled comms. It wasn't in English. It wasn't even in any known human tongue. Yet the implant behind his ear hummed, catching fragments, stitching them together in translation. "Warrior, whoever hears this, I fight with you." The voice was raw, female, filled with both desperation and defiance. It sounded close, as if the sender was transmitting from the planet below. David blinked, startled. They hadn't expected survivors on Vera 9, not after the Zarkoth began glassing the settlements. Who was she? Another refugee? No, her tone was too hardened, too seasoned for that. This was a soldier, someone still resisting even as the skies fell apart above her. The message repeated, breaking in and out with interference, but the intent was clear. She was asking, not for rescue, not for pity, but for comradeship. For someone, anyone, to stand with her in this doomed last stand. David's chest tightened. Humanity had been called many things in the galaxy, weak, fragile, short-lived. But what they never lacked was stubbornness. And here was proof they weren't the only ones willing to fight to the bitter end. Somewhere on that burning world, an alien warrior was still standing, blade in hand, daring the swarm to come closer. "The line is breaking!" a voice shouted from the bridge. Another console exploded, showering sparks. Someone screamed. David's thoughts snapped back to the present. His frigate's engines were crippled, maneuvering thrusters barely functional. They weren't leaving orbit alive, but maybe, just maybe, he could answer that call. As the captain staggered toward him, bloodied but resolute, he placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You'll have to take it planetside, son. The fight's not ending here. It's moving below." David didn't argue. Orders weren't needed. He'd already made his decision the moment he heard that voice. Somewhere down there, amidst burning forests and shattered cities, someone was still holding the line. And if humanity stood for anything, it was standing beside those who refused to surrender. He secured his biomask, checked the last grenades clipped to his armor, and sprinted for the escape pod bay as the Resolute shuddered under another barrage. Behind him, the ship that had been his home cracked and burned, but David kept moving. The swarm thought they could crush both humans and their allies. They were wrong, because the war was about to find new ground, Vera 9, and he would be there to meet it. The descent was a nightmare. David's escape pod screamed through the atmosphere, a coffin wrapped in fire. Metal rattled around him, flames licked the viewport, and the harness dug into his shoulders with every violent jolt. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he would simply burn before reaching the ground. But the pod held barely, slamming into the surface of Vera 9 with a bone-cracking crash that nearly knocked him unconscious. The hatch blew outward, smoke pouring into the poisoned air. David stumbled into a world on fire. The sky was black with ash and streaked with red, torn apart by falling wreckage. What had once been forests stretched across the horizon in jagged silhouettes of flame. He could taste the acrid bite of toxins even through the biomask's filters. And everywhere, the enemy. The Zarkoth swarmed across the land in endless streams. Their insectoid frames gleamed in the firelight, armor plates ridged and jagged, claws snapping like steel traps. They moved with chilling precision, not as individuals, but as a singular hive intent on devouring every living thing. David raised his rifle and fired. Each shot cracked with mechanical finality, punching through chitin and spraying alien ichor across the ground. He advanced step by step, pushing toward the ruins of a settlement half swallowed by flame. He had no squad, no orders, no fallback plan, only survival and the faint echo of the alien voice he'd heard. The settlement was nothing but husks of homes, alien towers toppled like broken teeth. Craters pocked the streets, and shattered bodies, some human, most not, lay strewn in grotesque stillness. But above the carnage there was motion, swift and furious. That's when he saw her. A towering figure moved in the chaos, cutting through the Zarkoth with savage grace. She wore armor that had once been flawless, but was now cracked and blackened, its once polished edges dulled by endless strikes. 4 arms wielded 2 spears that crackled with a strange energy, carving arcs of light through the swarm. Her movements weren't wild. They were deliberate, efficient, born of long training and the desperation of one who refused to bow, but she was losing ground. Dozens pressed in on her. Blood shimmered on her silver skin, glowing faintly in the firelight. Every slash took more out of her, every strike left her a fraction slower. David didn't hesitate. He sprinted forward, rifle blazing. Bullets tore into the nearest Zarkoth, splitting them apart before they could close on her. One swung a serrated claw at him, and he rolled aside, slamming a combat knife into the joint of its armored limb. Another rushed, but a grenade hurled into its gaping mandibles turned it into a shower of steaming shards. The alien warrior's eyes snapped toward him. Bright, fierce, and inhuman, they locked on his face through the smoke. For an instant, surprise flickered there. Then she turned back to the swarm. No words were exchanged, but an understanding passed between them. Fight together or die apart. Back to back, they carved a circle of survival. Her spears spun like storms, impaling and sweeping enemies aside. His rifle cracked until the barrel burned hot, and when it clicked dry, he switched to sidearm and blade. The clash of gunfire and metal rang like music amid the screams. The swarm surged again and again, but the 2 of them refused to break. David caught glimpses of her between movements, her jaw clenched in pain, her skin split by wounds, her breathing ragged. Yet she never faltered. And strangely, fighting beside her, neither did he. They shifted instinctively, covering each other's blind spots, anticipating the other's moves. It was as if some ancient warrior code guided them both, a rhythm of survival that transcended language or species. When the last Zarkoth fell, silence slammed down like a hammer. The battlefield around them was a ruin of twisted bodies and burning wreckage. David lowered his weapon, his arms trembling with exhaustion. The warrior collapsed to one knee, clutching a wound across her side. He approached, keeping his rifle ready but eyes on her. She looked up at him, silver eyes glowing faintly, her mandibles, if that's what they were, trembling with effort. Her lips parted, and for the first time he heard her voice, not through comms but in person. raw, strained, and heavy with pain. Whatever she said, he didn't understand. But the meaning was clear. She was hurt, dying, and still unwilling to quit. David knelt beside her. His hand brushed the ruined remains of her shattered helmet. He realized with a shock that the air of this world was toxic to her, just as it was to him. Her lungs were failing with every breath, and she had no protection left. For the first time since the war began, David hesitated. Because now, the mission wasn't just about holding the line. It was about a choice, whether to fight for himself alone or to fight for her too, and deep inside, he already knew the answer. The battlefield smoldered around them. The air was thick with poison and ash, so dense it stung David's throat even through the filters. He could hear the faint whistle of his biomask, struggling to keep up. His oxygen warning blinked red, pulsing like a heartbeat. 10 minutes of air left. The alien warrior beside him swayed, still gripping her spear, but her strength was fading. Silver blood trickled down her side where chitin claws had torn her armor open. She pulled at her own shattered breathing mask with trembling fingers, frustration and desperation flashing in her luminous eyes. David crouched, scanning her condition quickly. Her chest was rising in short, uneven bursts, her lips drawn back as if every breath was fire. He recognized the look, someone suffocating. Without protection, the toxins in Vera Navi's atmosphere were killing her faster than her wounds. She muttered words in her own language, broken and sharp. When her gaze fixed on his mask, he understood. She was telling him not to give it up. Her hand clamped on his wrist, shaking her head. She knew what it would cost, but David wasn't weighing choices anymore. The memory of her standing against an army, alone, surrounded, refusing to surrender, still burned in his mind. That kind of willpower was rare, even among humans. She hadn't asked for his help, hadn't begged. She'd simply fought. And now she was about to die because she had no air. He gritted his teeth. Not today. With a sharp twist, he unlatched his biomask. The moment the seal broke, the toxic air clawed at his lungs like fire. His throat burned raw, his chest tightened, and he coughed violently. Still, he forced the mask onto her face, pressing it tight until it locked in place. The change was immediate. She gasped deeply, her shoulders jerking as oxygen flooded back into her system. Her eyes widened, stunned, not just by survival, but by what he had done. David coughed again, harder this time, spitting flecks of blood into the dirt. His lungs screamed, but he forced a grin. Looks better on you anyway. For a heartbeat, the battlefield was quiet. Just the two of them, kneeling in the ruins, staring at one another. Her hand lifted slowly, hesitantly, and touched the mask now secured over her face. Then her gaze returned to him, unreadable but burning with something fierce, something almost human. There wasn't time to dwell. The swarm was never gone for long. Chittering echoes carried on the wind, the sound of fresh Zarkoth patrols closing in. The fight wasn't finished, and now David was weaker than ever. The warrior rose, steadier now, towering over him. She reached down, hauling him to his feet with surprising gentleness despite her size. He could feel her strength returning with every breath of clean air. Together, she said in broken English, the word harsh on her tongue but clear enough. David nodded, too breathless to reply. His vision blurred at the edges, every inhale tearing at his chest, but adrenaline kept him upright. He should have collapsed already, yet beside her he found enough strength to reload his rifle. The next wave came fast, dozens of insectoid forms pouring between the shattered towers. The warrior charged with a roar, spears blazing with energy, each strike cleaving enemies in half. David covered her flank, firing in bursts, his aim steady despite the pain ripping through his lungs. They fought as though bound by instinct. She shielded him with her massive frame when claws came too close. He picked off stragglers before they could overwhelm her from behind. Every time one stumbled, the other filled the gap. It was a rhythm neither had planned, yet it flowed seamlessly, a bond hammered in fire and blood. Hours blurred into a haze of violence. Corpses piled, fires raged. Still they pressed forward, carving their way toward the last human outpost marked on David's wrist display. The closer they drew, the heavier the resistance became, as if the swarm sensed their importance. By the time they reached the edge of the stronghold, both were staggering. David was pale, sweat soaking his uniform, every breath a shallow wheeze. She carried wounds across her arms and legs, her silver blood drying in streaks against dark armor. But when the fortress gates loomed ahead and human defenders spotted them through the haze, something remarkable happened. The soldiers inside, exhausted, beaten down by days of hopeless defense, saw not just one of their own staggering toward them, but a colossal alien warrior carrying him, breathing through a human mask, fighting at his side. For the first time in days, the survivors found something to believe in. Their battered rifles lifted. Their voices rose in ragged cheers, and the gates opened. Together, human and alien staggered inside, side by side, and though David's lungs burned as if they were filled with knives, he smiled faintly. Because for the first time in this war, he knew they weren't alone. The fortress was a ruin masquerading as a sanctuary. Its walls, once smooth blocks of stone reinforced with steel plating, were cracked, scorched, and riddled with holes from plasma bombardments. Inside, maybe 200 human soldiers and a scattering of alien refugees clung to survival with shaking hands and empty magazines. The defenders had been pushed back until this fortress was all that stood between the swarm and complete annihilation on Vera 9. When David stumbled through the gates, supported by the towering alien warrior, silence fell across the courtyard. Every head turned. For a moment, the sight was so strange it silenced despair. A human soldier half dead, leaning against a massive silver-skinned being wearing a human breathing mask. She still clutched her blood-stained spears, armor cracked and dented, her presence filling the space like thunder. Then the silence broke. A ragged cheer tore through the defenders. To them, this was proof that resistance still mattered. If a human and a warrior from another world could stand together against the swarm, maybe they could hold one more day. David coughed hard, his lungs screaming from the poison he had breathed earlier, but he raised a hand in a vague salute. He had no words left, only determination. The warrior beside him growled something in her language and raised her spear high, the sound echoing off the shattered walls like a battle horn. The defenders roared in answer. There was no time to rest. The swarm came quickly. The first tremor shook the ground, dust falling from cracked beams overhead. Then came the screech, high-pitched, metallic, and piercing. The enemy poured across the fields like a black flood, claws scraping, wings buzzing, eyes glowing with hive-born hunger. Hundreds, then thousands rushing the gates. The defenders braced. Machine guns rattled from the ramparts, tracer rounds stitching glowing arcs into the advancing horde. Rockets streaked out, exploding among clustered enemies, tearing chitin apart. The air filled with smoke, fire, and the stench of burning alien flesh. But the Zarkoth did not break. They climbed over the dead, scaling the walls with bladed limbs, hammering against barricades with impossible strength. The fortress shook under their weight. David forced himself to the wall, rifle in hand. His vision was blurry, but muscle memory kept him steady. Each pull of the trigger dropped another enemy climbing too close. His breathing was shallow, ragged, but he ignored the agony. Beside him, the alien warrior moved like a storm unleashed. She leapt into the thickest fighting, her forearms a blur as her spears spun arcs of lightning, cutting down whole clusters of invaders in seconds. At one point, a massive drone beast crashed through the wall, snapping soldiers like twigs. The defenders panicked until she charged it head-on, driving both spears into its thorax, flipping it backward into its kin. The sight reignited the defense. Soldiers rallied, screaming as they surged forward, pushing the enemy back inch by bloody inch. Hours blurred into a relentless siege. The ground was slick with ichor, the air choked with smoke. Men and women screamed orders, reloaded, bled, and fell. David lost count of how many times he fired, reloaded, or dragged another soldier back from the edge. His strength was nearly gone, his lips blue from oxygen deprivation, but still he fought. The alien warrior never left his side for long. Even when she broke into the enemy ranks, she always circled back, placing herself between him and danger. Once, when a Zarkoth claw slashed across his chest, she intercepted the killing blow with her own body, driving her spear through the attacker even as blood poured from her shoulder. By the time dawn, or what passed for dawn through the ash-filled sky, broke over Vera 9, the fortress still stood, barely, but it stood. And then, through the clouds, the survivors saw salvation. Massive shadows fell across the battlefield as human dreadnoughts burst from orbit. Their hulls glowed with fresh shields, their cannons charged with nuclear fury. Missiles rained down like judgment, vaporizing entire clusters of Zarkoth in firestorms. Fighter squadrons screamed overhead, strafing the enemy lines with precision. The defenders erupted in cheers. Some collapsed from exhaustion, weeping openly. Others laughed through bloodied lips. David leaned against the wall, too weak to stand fully, his rifle slipping from numb fingers. Relief washed through him, but it was thin, fragile. He knew the fight wasn't over. The swarm had lost the advantage, but a hive that large would not retreat without unleashing something worse. Beside him, the alien warrior turned her gaze to the horizon. Her silver eyes narrowed, her body tense despite the sudden shift in momentum. She seemed to sense what David did, that the real battle was still coming. And as he coughed blood into his hand, his vision tunneling, David felt it too. The storm wasn't done. It was only gathering. For a fleeting moment, the battlefield felt like victory. The swarm was scattering beneath the weight of orbital bombardments, their ranks burning in sheets of fire as dreadnought guns split the ground into molten scars. Human fighters weaved above like falcons, tearing through what remained of the enemy air cover. The survivors inside the fortress dared to believe the nightmare was ending, but hope turned to dread in seconds. The ground trembled, harder this time, as if the planet itself groaned under the weight of something vast. A shadow fell across the courtyard, blotting out the pale daylight bleeding through the smoke. When David looked up, his blood ran cold. It was the Hive Lord. The creature descended on wings like serrated sails, each beat of them shaking the ruins with hurricane force. Its body towered as tall as the fortress walls, armored in plates thicker than tank hulls, every limb a barbed weapon built for annihilation. Its many eyes glowed like molten coals, radiating raw malice. Around its torso, smaller drone forms clung like parasites, shrieking as they leapt free to join the slaughter. The defenders' cheers choked into silence. They had fought bravely against endless numbers, but this was no ordinary foe. It was the swarm's heart-made flesh. The Hive Lord struck first, its claws ripped into the fortress wall, tearing through stone and steel as though they were paper. Defenders were thrown into the air, crushed beneath rubble or shredded by the shockwave. David was hurled against a barricade, the breath knocked from his lungs. The alien warrior roared defiantly, planting her spear into the ground and bracing for the next assault. The Hive Lord let out a shriek that rattled bones, then lunged. David staggered to his feet, chest heaving. His lungs felt like shattered glass, each breath shallow and desperate, but his mind was razor-sharp. He scanned the chaos, searching for anything that could stop something that massive. Heavy cannons fired from the wall, striking its armor, but the blasts ricocheted harmlessly. Rockets flared against its chest, only scorching its outer plating. Nothing worked. The warrior launched herself at it, spears flashing. She slashed at its face, driving one weapon deep into an eye, and the beast reeled back, bellowing in fury. But its massive claw swept across, smashing into her like a hammer. She was thrown across the courtyard, her armor cracking as she hit the ground hard. David's heart lurched. She didn't rise. He dragged himself upright, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. His hand brushed the last grenade clipped to his belt, the only explosive he had left. He stared at it for a long second, the realization settling in. A grenade alone wouldn't kill something that size, but lodged inside its vulnerable core, it could. It would. He glanced at the alien warrior. She was stirring faintly, trying to crawl back to her feet, but she was too wounded to continue. She had fought harder than anyone he'd ever seen, but even her strength had limits. If she fell, the defenders would crumble behind her. There was no choice. David's chest tightened as he drew in what little breath he had left. He knew his lungs wouldn't hold out much longer anyway. The poison had already taken root, hollowing him from the inside. His body was failing, but his will wasn't. He gripped the grenade, pulled the pin with his teeth, and sprinted. The Hive Lord reared back, its maw opening wide in a roar that shook the fortress to its foundations. David charged straight into it, weaving past crushing claws, ducking under slashing limbs. Bullets and rockets flew past him, defenders shouting in horror as they realized what he intended. He leapt. The grenade was clenched in his fist as he slammed into the beast's chest, grabbing hold of a cracked seam where the warrior's spear had wounded it earlier. The carapace split under his desperate strength, and he shoved the grenade deep inside, forcing it past twitching muscle and pulsing veins of alien energy. "Not today," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The blast ripped outward with thunderous force. The Hive Lord shrieked, its body convulsing as fire consumed its insides. The explosion burst from its chest, tearing its wings apart, ripping through its armor in a cascade of molten gore. The creature collapsed, shaking the earth as it fell. Its death scream echoed across the battlefield before cutting off in a final, trembling shudder. David was thrown clear, his body crashing into rubble. Pain roared through him, but it was fading fast, slipping into numbness. He tasted blood, his lungs refusing to draw air anymore. Above him, the sky flickered with the glow of burning wreckage and the streaks of Allied firepower. He couldn't move. He didn't need to. The fortress still stood, and the swarm's leader was dead. The others would scatter now, their hive mind broken. Humanity would endure another day. His vision blurred, but one last image burned clear. The alien warrior staggering toward him, silver eyes wide with shock and grief. He wanted to tell her it was worth it, that he'd do it again, but the words never came. His chest stilled, his gaze fixed skyward, and then darkness. Silence swept across the battlefield after the Hive Lord fell. For the first time in days, the screeching swarm stopped mid-cry. The death of their master sent confusion racing through their ranks, their formations collapsing like sand washed away by a storm tide. The survivors of the fortress, bloodied and exhausted, lifted their weapons again, not out of fear, but out of fury. "Push them back," someone roared, and they did. Human rifles cracked, alien blades cut, and ships above scorched the ground with relentless strikes. The swarm broke apart, drones scattering in blind retreat, their hunger turned to panic. The defenders surged with new strength, driven by rage and the knowledge that they still had a chance to live. Amid the renewed chaos, the alien warrior staggered across the ruined courtyard. Her armor was broken, her body trembling, yet her eyes fixed on one thing only, the man who lay motionless in the rubble. David. She fell to her knees beside him, her breath rasping in pained sobs. His chest no longer rose. His biomask hung cracked and useless, the faint hiss of its filters gone silent. He had given his last air, not just minutes earlier when he shared it with her, but finally here, his very life for a cause he did not owe, and for a warrior he had barely known. For a moment she felt the weight of failure. She had sworn to protect, yet it was this fragile human who had stood between her people and annihilation. Her hands shook as she pressed them to his face as if sheer will might call him back. But no miracle came. His gaze was fixed, his body still. The thunder of victory carried on around her, but in her chest, only silence remained. When the swarm was finally purged and the fortress secure, commanders and soldiers gathered around the fallen man. Some bowed their heads, others whispered words in languages David would never hear. Even hardened veterans, alien and human alike, stood in quiet reverence. He had not just destroyed the Hive Lord, he had given the impossible, hope. The alien warrior rose slowly, carrying David's body in her arms. Though she staggered under his weight, she would not let another touch him. Her kin fell into step behind her, a solemn procession through the smoke and wreckage. The human survivors joined them, forming a silent guard of honor. Enemies who had once fought on opposite sides now walked together, united by the sacrifice of one man. At the fortress gate, She laid him on a slab of stone, the broken sunlight spilling across his still face. She placed her spear beside him, a gesture of warrior's respect, then removed the crest from her own armor and set it on his chest. In her culture, that act meant only one thing: eternal kinship. Around them, voices rose, not in grief alone, but in oath. Humans and aliens both swore his name would be carried into every battle, every song, every hall of remembrance. He was no longer a stranger. He was legend. The warrior lifted her head, voice raw but steady. He gave breath to one not his own. He gave life for those he did not know. He gave us tomorrow. This is humanity. Her words echoed through the ruins, carried on the wind, and something in the hearts of all who heard shifted. Where there had been suspicion and division, there was now understanding. Where there had been fragile alliances, there was now a bond forged in blood and sacrifice. Days later, when reinforcements finally arrived and the fortress was secured, the tale of the man named David spread faster than fire. Soldiers repeated it in hushed tones over comms. Fleets carried it back to orbit. And soon entire planets spoke of the human who gave his last breath to save another species. Statues were raised, not of generals or kings, but of him, helmet cracked, grenade clutched, gaze unflinching. Across worlds, his story became a rallying cry that courage did not ask for reward and sacrifice did not require kinship. That sometimes the smallest act, sharing a mask, a single breath, could change the fate of civilizations. The alien warrior never forgot. Each dawn she carried his memory into battle, her armor repaired but always bearing one deliberate flaw, a crack across the chest, painted crimson to mark the wound where he had fallen. When questioned, she spoke plainly. "I fight with his breath inside me." Generations later, when the swarm was finally driven into extinction, children of both species grew up hearing his name as the first lesson in courage. "David," they whispered, as though the sound itself was a shield. And in that way, though his body lay silent in the dust of a ruined fortress, his sacrifice never truly ended. The breath he gave lived on, in warriors, in families, in the unbreakable bond between species that once stood apart. He had died without knowing her name. Yet she, and all who followed, would never stop speaking his.